Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Juliana, for the kind introduction. Thanks also to Attila and the organizing committee for the invitation to deliver this lecture here today. So I'm going to be talking about our work on emerging and current cooling technologies. I'm not a turbulence person per se, but obviously there is turbulence in my work. I only don't investigate it. I just use it and have to deal with it. So I divided my talk into these three topics. The first one is related to the interaction between the lubricating oil and the refrigerant in hermetic compressors. I'm calling this a current technology or a current challenge. And the other ones are the countercurrent flow limitation in condensing refrigerants. Although condensation in thermal systems and refrigeration systems happen in any application, but in oil-free compressors, it brings some new interesting aspects into the analysis. And then finally, I'm going to present an emerging application of vapor compression cooling systems for cooling of electronics and power electronics. So refrigeration is all around us. The numbers are actually very impressive if we consider all the segments of the technology, from fruit preservation to transportation and room air conditioning. If we only consider domestic units, the numbers are still very impressive. According to the United Nations, there are more refrigerators than cars worldwide, and also considering the emerging economies, the number of domestic units is expected to double in the next 12 years or so. And in terms of the share of refrigeration, accounts for about 10% of the electricity consumption in emerging economy households. And in developed countries, this share becomes even larger if one considers heating and cooling. So it's a very important industry, and the numbers are quite impressive indeed. And as a community, we have done quite well in terms of reducing both the direct and the indirect effect of energy and the environmental impact. If you consider the TWE, which is the total equivalent warming impact, in the past 30 years or so, both parts have declined quite considerably. The direct effect is related to the emissions of carbon dioxide upon, when you discard a refrigerator or if you have a leakage. And the indirect effect is related to the emissions of the CO2 associated with the burning of fossil fuels to generate electricity to run the efficient and inefficient systems. The evolution is impressive, yes, and it's also driven by regulation. By hearing Professor Mastorako's talk yesterday, the same thing happens in refrigeration. First, there is a challenge, the standards and labeling, and then the industry makes it happen, and then after that, only the scientific community tries to understand what's going on. We have gone a long way into improving the efficiency of compressors. This red line here shows the energy consumption of a household refrigerator over the years. Although the size of the refrigerator has increased a little bit, the volume, the blue line, and but there are still many challenges, most of them related to replacement of the global warming potential refrigerants. And they are going to be replaced by hydrocarbons or CO2, and they also have their problems in terms of flammability and high pressures and so on. So about 15 years ago, when I was starting my career, I read this United Nations report on room air conditioning and heat pumps, and they identified 5 areas for increasing the energy efficiency in household refrigerator systems. And I identified 3 main areas related to multiphase flow and heat and mass transfer, which were interesting to study, and all of them were related to the oil interaction with the refrigerant in refrigeration systems and compressors. So I thought it was an interesting area to work on. So here's where I start my talk, and here's our typical vapor compression cooling systems. It is composed of two heat exchangers, a condenser and evaporator, a compressor and expansion device that regulate the zones of high and low pressure, high pressure in the condenser, low pressure in the evaporator. And in its simplest configuration, the cooling capacity of this system is controlled by the on-off of the compressor. So we always hear in our kitchen the refrigerator switching on and off. Basically, it's controlling the cooling capacity together with a thermostat. And there is lubricating oil sitting inside the compressor in the sump there. And this oil obviously has, the main role is lubrication of moving of solid parts, but it also acts towards reducing noise and cooling, and also sealing, but it also keeps what we call the equalizing pressure, which is the pressure attained by the system when the compressor switches off, when it's controlling the cooling capacity. So the oil absorbs the refrigerant inside the crankcase and reduces this equalizing pressure. So the lower the equalizing pressure, less torque is needed to start up the compressor again. Less torque means less copper in the electrical motor, and less copper means you have a cheaper compressor. So selecting the lubricating oil is also important for that aspect as well. So we have a problem of absorption of the refrigerant, of the gas inside the oil. And the flip side of that is that when the compressor switches back on again, then the refrigerant which is dissolved in the oil sump will foam. It may foam, it will be dissolved. And if foam is formed, then you may have reliability issue because this liquid in the foam may reach the compression chamber. So the first set of experiments that we did was to try to measure rates of absorption of the refrigerant in the lubricating oil. And we devised this PVT cell in which we have the oil sitting there. And this is initially under vacuum. So refrigerant from this tank is flows into the PVT cell, and we measure the mass flow rate, and after the pressure equalizes, we close the system and the pressure decreases as a result of the refrigerant absorption. The interesting thing here is that when we have synthetic refrigerants, mainly R134A and the new types of olefins which are being considered, the liquid refrigerant is heavier than the lubricating oil. So we are going to have a really unstable layer here, and the absorption phenomena is going to be dominated by natural convection. On the other hand, if you have CO2 or isobutane or propane, natural refrigerants, the liquid refrigerant is lighter than the lubricating oil. So the absorption is going to be governed by diffusion only. So it's going to be a much slower process. So here we can see typical diffusion dominated absorption. It takes hours for the pressure to equalize. So here in this video was actually one of the first studies that we made a few years ago. We can see the natural convection absorption phenomenon taking place in R134A. So we, based on this stability analysis by other authors, we developed a model to calculate the critical Rayleigh number for this this instability to take place. The result was that the critical time wasn't too large, so it didn't matter much how long it took for the system to become unstable. It was basically governed by natural convection. And of course, we developed models for convection-dominated absorption as well. These were simple models, but they were incorporated into codes that to design compressors. And absorption governed by diffusion was also modeled, and this was very important to develop models for CO2 compressors. When you have CO2 and the lubricating oil, the system is it's very non-ideal. Meaning that you need to consider thermodynamic non-idealities in order to calculate this diffusivity here, and the swelling effect is also very important. So the refrigerant is absorbed in the oil, and the oil expands, the oil layer expands quite significantly, and this has caused some problems in the field. The model itself is quite simple. We need to take into account thermodynamic effects, and basically what we predict is the pressure as a function of time to check if the model is working fine. So we can see here that the pressure behaves accordingly with the experiments, and here is the swelling effect of the CO2 absorption, which can be quite significant. So now moving on to the other aspect of the problem, the foam formation. We did some batch desorption experiments. This is the test section that we used. It's quite different from the one that we had before. It's a long tube because we want to see the foam growing inside this tube here. And this is connected to a mass flow meter. We want to measure the refrigerant desorption rate starting from a saturated mixture inside the test section, and we have a magnetic agitator here in order to trigger the desorption phenomenon. So we did this experiment with R134A and 1234YF and some synthetic lubricant. And here are some videos as well. This video is quite long, so I'm going to just have some clips here of that video. So what you see here is the magnetic agitator there, and the nucleation site starts at that surface. They are triggered there at the surface, and this is quite comparable to what happens in the real system, because you have the oil pump in the sump. The sump also rotates there. And we can see the bubbles reaching the surface, and because of some surface tension forces, the foam will grow, and you can see the typical foam structure with the plateau borders and the foam growth, and then later the foam decay. So here's the behavior of the pressure and of the mass flow rate that we measure. The mass flow rate has this funny behavior here because we see initially the mass flow rate increases quite sharply. That's because of the free gas that is flowing through the valve. And then this other part here is the desorption from the lubricating oil, the liquid, which has a much longer time scale. And here's the height of the liquid foam that we measure from the videos. The growth stage is quite fast, and it's approximately linear, and the drainage step is consists of two parts. The first one is a lower part, and the second one, it's more like accelerated drainage because of the evaporation from the plateau borders and also rearrangement of the gas bubbles in the foam. And we adopted a control volume approach to model this problem. So based on mass transfer rates between the two domains. So an overall mass balance is used to calculate the height of the liquid layer, and then there's a liquid species mass balance to calculate the concentration and so on. And we rely on closure relationships for these mass fluxes there, and so the m dot d is the desorption mass flux, so it's basically associated with the evaporation at the interface of the bubbles, and then we have the entrainment mass flow rate, which is responsible for carrying liquid from the bottom to the foam layer, and then finally the drainage through the plateau borders reaching the bottom layer. And we have developed some phenomenological models for each one of those fluxes. The desorption mass flow rate, we relied on the classical nucleation theory to come up with a relationship for that. Basically, we have here inside this mass flux a Gibbs number, which is the relationship between the mechanical work required to create the bubbles and the liquid supersaturation, which is the energy available to create this new phase. And the entrainment is the closure relationship is based on a continuity of mass here at this interface, and the drainage mass flow rate, we relied on the porous medium analogy to calculate the flow through the plateau borders by using an equivalent permeability for this flexible porous medium there. Of course, we need to have some empirical constants to fit the model, but overall, from an engineering standpoint, the results were quite good, and we could predict with some degree of accuracy the behavior of the height of the foam layer. We were not quite successful at predicting the two-step decay, because I think we need a more detail, a more a multidimensional, let's say, approach to modeling this effect. But in order to be incorporated into design codes, it was quite successful. Obviously, running in the background, we have to have some infrastructure to characterize these physical properties, so we can measure not only the viscosity, but also the phase behavior of these mixtures and other properties as well, such electrical properties and some surface properties. So now moving on to the second part of the talk, I'm just going to talk briefly about this issue with the countercurrent flow limitation in condensing refrigerants. The main drive for this research is the use of oil-free compressors. So when you have a compressor that is oil lubricated, then the compressor has to sit at the lowest part of your system, because the oil needs to go back to the sump and by gravity. When you have a oil-free compressor, the designer has the freedom to position the components of the system at his or her will, provided that liquid that is formed in the condensing line does not flow back to the compressor through the discharge. So this is a classical problem, say countercurrent flow limitation, flooding, and flow reversals is a classical problem in the nuclear industry, but then we found some interesting application here in refrigeration system design. So we want to basically look at this problem. We have an upward flow of refrigerant, which is condensing in a vertical or inclined tube. And as the liquid is formed, the gas loses its ability to carry the liquid upward, so the liquid that is formed starts to oscillate. And this is what we don't want. So we have this experimental facility here. Is basically a refrigeration loop. We have the oil-free compressor. Here we have the condenser, which is the first part of the condenser is our test section. We guarantee that at the inlet of the test section, we have a fixed inlet superheating degree. And so we have condensation. Here is a counter current flow heat exchanger. And then downstream of this test section, we have another condenser, just to make sure that we're not going to have a two-phase mixture entering the expansion device here, then an evaporator and closing the system. So this is a closer look at the test section. It's a counter current flow heat exchanger, as I said. So the cooling water flows on the inside the annular gap. And in this particular study, we carried out a visualization study in order to identify the conditions at which the flow reversal would start to occur. So basically we have, here's the test section. We have a high-speed camera and a LED source with a slit in order to create a kind of a light sheet to illuminate part of the flow. So here it's what I was trying to explain. When we have a high vapor content, then the Wallace, so-called Wallace parameter, which is a modified Froude number, it's greater than 1. So that means that the vapor is capable of carrying the liquid upwards. But as the condensation rate increases, then we start to have a higher liquid content, and the gas, basically the vapor, loses momentum to drag the liquid upwards. If we increase that a little bit further, then we start to see the liquid starting to flow back, and that's what we don't want. We don't want to see this transition from annular to two-phase flow. Not that we don't want to see, we just want to make sure that it doesn't cause any unwanted effect. So in this particular study, we developed an image processing technique which is composed of a few steps here. And in order to make those images of the liquid film as a spatial temporal array, so we can study their time and position dependent characteristics. So basically we digitize the images, and this video shows for downflow, for downward flow, what we have in terms of the liquid film on one side of the tube. And then with that array of the position of the interface in pixels as a function of time and position at a certain interrogation area, we can calculate some properties of those surface waves. So when we plot the film thickness as a function of position and time, the inclination of these streaks here, where the brighter parts are the crests of the waves, we can estimate the velocity of the waves and their frequency. So in this condition here, we have the Wallace parameter is greater than 1. So in upward flow, the flow is unidirectional. But when we have the Wallace parameter of this order here, 0.5, 0.6, we can see that the wave starts to decelerate and have a behavior which is seen in adiabatic annular flows, and they are related to the source of liquid entrainment and so on. And this was actually one of the first studies to actually measure this wave behavior in condensing systems. So another study that we did trying to explore this technique a little bit further was to study slug flow initiation, which is not related to refrigeration, but it's an important problem in the oil industry. And we use the same technique in order to capture the formation of liquid slugs. And this, as this is a turbulence conference, I thought it was interesting just to put this, that I used a turbulence. We use a turbulence model here just to try to model this this phenomenon of slug initiation using CFD code. So the results were quite encouraging, but we need to improve this from the side of the mathematical modeling and the experimental technique as well. And we can see, when comparing the experimental work and the numerical work, the evolution of the liquid slug in along the tube. So now, moving on to the last part of the talk, one needs to find now new applications for vapor compression systems, and one of them is cooling of electronics, of cooling of concentrated heat sources, such as power electronics and other systems. So we came up with this idea of, we call it Sphinx, and it stands for spray heat sink integrated with the expansion device. We try to explore the high heat transfer coefficient associated with impinging jets and sprays, and the unique ability of refrigeration systems of having the heat sink temperature below the ambient temperature. When you have a liquid circulation system, the lowest temperature that you can have is the ambient temperature. But when you have a refrigeration system, you can operate at temperatures which are lower than the ambient temperature. So it's a double gain. You have a high heat transfer coefficient and a temperature inside the heat sink which is below the ambient. So we couple the expansion device and the evaporator into a single unit. So the liquid, high pressure liquid coming from the condenser will reach the top of this device here and will expand through orifices, which will create an impinging jet on a heated surface. So this is the experimental apparatus. Again, it is a refrigeration loop. And in this case, we have an oil-free compressor. It's a small-scale compressor. It's not actually a miniature compressor. It's like a mesoscale compressor. It fits on the palm of your hand if you have a large hand, but it's still smaller than most compressors. And so downstream of the compressor, we have a mass flow meter condenser, and then from the condenser, the system here, the Sphinx unit, and then we have a trace heater just to control the inlet superheat into the compressor, closing the system. And in this study, we also devised a calorimeter to measure the power consumption and the heat rejection rate by the compressor. So basically, put the compressor inside this control volume here, and we have a thermoelectric cooler which is responsible for maintaining temperature inside this ambient equal to the temperature outside. So by measuring the power in and the power associated with running the thermoelectric cooler, we can calculate how much heat is being dissipated by the compressor. So all of this system is verified against the first law. So we have a very careful thermal balance there. And this is an actual pressure enthalpy diagram of the system. So 1 and 2 is the compressor, here is the condenser. From 3 to 4 is the actual useful cooling effect of this device. And then from 4, actually the numbers are not quite right here, but this piece here, 4 to 1, is the power, the heating power associated with the trace heater that it has to be used in the experimental facility, but not necessarily in the real application. I can explain that a little bit better if someone has a question about that. So these are the independent and dependent variables in the study. Basically, we can vary the jet length, which is the height of the chamber, the distance between the orifice and the heater, the number of orifices and their diameters, the compressor stroke, although we operated in most tests at full stroke, the hot end temperature, which is in the experimental facility controlled by a thermal bath, but in a real world it will be the ambient temperature, the ambient air temperature, and the thermal load, of course. And then the dependent variables, we measure the surface temperature, the condensing and evaporating temperatures. It's a closed system, so if we change one thing, the whole of the system responds in a way or another. The flow rate and the compressor power, they are dependent variables as well. We measure them. The heat transfer coefficient can be calculated based on those measurements, and obviously the COP, which is the most important parameter in this study. And we have studied several orifice configurations during the course of this project. I'm going to explain them a little bit better, but basically what I'm going to show here is a comparison between colliding jets and directly impinging jets on the surface. And we can play with the number of jets and their configuration here, because we have this at the top of this piece here, we place this other piece with dummy orifices and actual orifices and so on. And the visualization, most of it was done with using a high-speed video camera, and some playing with LED sources and mirror and diffuser. Try to not actually measure droplet size, because it's quite a challenge in a closed system, but only looking at the interaction between the impinging jets and the liquid film that is formed on the surface, and the what we're measuring using RTDs on the surface. So the colliding jet configuration is as follows. We have at the top cap here, we have this unit which can have 3 or 2 orifices, and these are inclined orifices, as you can see here, and they would meet at a point here which is inside the chamber. And then as these jets, they collide with each other, they form a spray cone that impinges on the surface. It's actually a quite useful way to atomize the jet into droplets. And here are some videos which help to show that. So this is for a taller chamber, and this is for a shorter chamber. You can see the 3 jets in this case meeting here at this point, and then forming a spray colliding on the surface there. These waves here are the liquid that spent liquid that flows on the window. Just and the parallel jet configuration, it's more easy. It's easier to understand. Basically, have that unit here on top. We can have dummy orifices there of different sizes, and we can play with this configuration. So basically, in order to make a more, I'll play the video as I speak. In order to have a comparison which is more fair in a way, when comparing colliding jets and parallel jets, we have the same area of passage, the same orifice area. And because it's also difficult to control the refrigerant charge, the amount of refrigerant that goes into the system, because the volumes are different, we always start the test with the same, having the same wall superheat for the initial thermal load. It's a fair way to compare. So these are the first comparisons that we have, comparing 2 and 3 colliding jets with the same jet chamber height. Obviously, as expected, 3 jets perform better than 2 jets. You can see here from the boiling curve and from the heat transfer coefficient curve there. And that's basically because we have a better distribution of the liquid on the heated surface. You can see here with two jets, there is this dry spot here, even at 25 watts of thermal load, which persists up to 100 watts. And this is the main cause for the dry out, because that dry spot just grows, and it's not possible to wet that surface anymore. And here's just for reference, we measure the saturation temperatures, and we measure the pressures and the compressor consumption and the COP. What is interesting about this study was that we can play with the number of orifices and their configurations. The thermal response of the heater, of course, depends a lot on that, but the thermal response of the system as a whole in terms of COP, compressor consumption, is not so different. And here's a comparison between the effect of the height of the chamber for 3 colliding jets, and also the effect of the ambient temperature. Basically, what we can see here is that when we have a shorter chamber, this white symbols here, the dry out is reached earlier, and that's because of splattering of the liquid onto the surface. When you have taller chamber, the impact circle is a little bit larger, and so the droplets, they don't splash back, and the liquid is capable of wetting the system a little bit better. So I'll just skip these videos here, because we have similar videos in the next slides in the comparison between colliding and parallel jets now. Again, we try to, for a meaningful comparison base, we took a reference case to compare those, and we are using the same orifice, equivalent orifice area between the colliding and the parallel jets. And in the parallel jets, we play a little bit with the, we play with the configuration of the active orifices. So this is the effect of H, the height and the flow rate, and basically the higher the flow rate, the better the response of the system. Impinging jets and sprays are very sensitive to the flow rate, so when you increase the flow rate, the heat transfer performance increases quite well. And this is the boiling curve. We can see that the higher heat transfer coefficient here is achieved for this higher mass flow rate, and the colliding jets, we can see here the decrease of the heat transfer coefficient in the colliding jets because of the increase of that dry spot. So for some reason, for colliding jets, the dry out is not as sharp as in the impinging jets. So I think I'm running out of time. I'm going to just show this video here for 2 flow rates. As we increase the thermal load, we can see that the liquid starts to dry here at the surface. So what is clear here to us is that in order to improve the effectiveness of this system, we need to work on the surface. So we need to make to increase the wettability of the surface in order to stick the liquid more onto the surface and delay that dry out. So this is something that we are going to pursue in the next steps of this work. So this is, again, some system variables. As I mentioned, didn't change much. And this, just to finalize my talk, the comparison between the parallel and the colliding jets. As I was saying, the dry out in the parallel jets is much sharper than in the colliding jets. And although the thermal response of colliding jets is a little bit better, we still have to work on this liquid distribution here on the surface in order to improve the wettability of the heater. So, yeah, I think I can end my talk now. And just as a final conclusion, vapor compression refrigeration is a mature but constantly adapting technology. It's an area which has been through many changes, many substitutions of refrigerants, replacements, but it somehow has managed to improve the efficiency. Of course, some areas are cost-driven, so small changes make a very big difference. And as a community, we have many challenges ahead. And the one that interests me the most is in finding new applications for vapor compression and other cooling technologies. So with that, I thank you for listening to me, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jader. Any questions, comments? Yes, please.
One question. What is the effect of this new system on the total size of the refrigerant unit? I mean, is it more compact now because you are practically merging expansion valve and evaporation? Mm-hmm. What is the effect on the whole system size? Because of the heat transfer effects and these. Mm-hmm.
It has a potential to become much more compact. Obviously, we didn't optimize for having the compressor close to. It was an experimental facility, but the heater size is 6 square centimeters, and so that it may not be applicable to very small electronics, but antenna, laser cooling, it's a potential application. The device itself fits on the palm of your hand and the compressor as well. So maybe a shoebox would be equivalent in size for some application.
Thank you.
It's not good enough for a laptop computer, but for a server or some other application.
Thank you very much for the nice talk. I was wondering, you said in the beginning that you're not measuring like the droplets size. Is this something you're looking into, changing maybe the nozzle and changing maybe the droplet sizes?
We haven't reached that point yet. Obviously, it would be much very interesting to measure droplet size. We were first interested in see if the idea would work and try to play with the macro parameters and have the envelope of operation of the system. And now we are playing with different colliding jet, parallel jet configurations. When we reach that point, maybe after we sort out the heater surface geometry for wettability, maybe there will be an interesting measuring droplet size, because it's easier when you have like a water or some other type of fluid that you can expand, but here the system is closed and it's hermetic, so it would be a little bit trickier to measure that. But obviously we are interested.
But it may be connected, right? The wettability and the droplet sizes and everything. Mm-hmm. So it's
we can. The correlations that we use to design the system, they are very much dependent on flow rate and droplet size. So droplet size is obviously very, very important.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Any more comments or questions? So let's thank again Jader for